Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. As you'll hear further into this episode, a refrain that you're going to hear from me time and time again is how difficult I have found it to try and piece this season together. Which songs to group together, which ending point, what starting point, when there's not really songs, so to speak, within the score. Sometimes it's difficult to understand, should this be the beginning? Should this be the ending? There's no resolution necessarily. This is just, one long piece that I am semi-arbitrarily breaking up into smaller pieces. Mostly I'm going with whatever the track listing is on the original Broadway cast to try and make some decisions here and there, but hopefully you can enjoy my fumbling around for the next 12 or 13 episodes. The other thing that I mentioned in this week's episode that I just wanted to, underline here at the very beginning is my fascination with the character of the Doctor in this piece. Not necessarily in the Broadway production, but definitely in the book and the movie. There is this, not necessarily sinister, but definitely ulterior motives that seem to be circling around whenever the Doctor arrives. It's sort of here in the Broadway show, but I'd love to hear what other people's thoughts are. Please write in on what your feelings are, or if I'm just making something completely out of nothing. Anyways, let's get into this week's episode and talk about some letters.
Clara, I cried. Imagine that, a soldier who cries. I had to hide my
Brian Holcomb, thank you so much for coming back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We both thought it had been like 2 or 3 years since the last time you were on this show. And then I quickly did a double check and realized it's been 4.5. So
time flies.
I know. So A Little Night Music was the last show that you were a part of, which does, now that I say it out loud, seem like a lifetime ago in many, many cases. But just to jump right into what we're talking about here today, I'd love to hear about your journey with Passion specifically. When did this first come into your life?
Well, Passion is sort of unusual for me in Sondheim shows in that I had become a fan of Sondheim with Sunday in the Park with George and then Into the Woods. And so Passion was the first show, well, I guess technically Assassins was the first show, but then Passion was the first show that was being produced before I already knew it. So when I first became a fan of Sondheim, like everybody, I went back and started listening to Company and Follies and everything. But those were all things that were over. And when Passion came around, it was the first time that I could actually go to New York and see a Sondheim show. So that was sort of my introduction to it. I remember buying the CD at not Barnes & Noble, Borders Books and Music, a long-defunct store. Yeah. And deciding not to listen to the last several tracks of it because I knew I was going to New York to see it and I didn't want to know how it ended. So I was like, I'm going to save the end and see what happens. So this was an interesting show for me because I went into it not quite knowing what to expect.
The one constant, I think, about Sondheim fandom, even though there is certainly an argument for the Sondheim sound or the Sondheim lyric, you can kind of pick up on that the more you do deep dives like I've been doing here for the past few years. But each show is very different than what the last show is. It's not like, oh, he's the guy who does blank. It really is, kind of goes all over the place. So like when you found out, I guess, what this show was, quote unquote, about, how did you take that? Was that something that was like exciting to you, or you're like, how is this going to work?
I think it was a little bit more of the how is this going to work? But I'd already gotten through, Sunday in the Park with George and Assassins, and I trusted that it was going to. Because I knew that they always found a way to make their odd subject matter work. But when I first listened to it and heard about it, I thought, well, this doesn't seem maybe like quite enough of a story to make a show out of. And it's obviously a very internal show. It's much more about what people are feeling rather than what they're doing.
Which does lend itself to make sense for it to be turned into a musical because everyone is being so explicit with what they're feeling.
Yes.
I think a great call out that another guest has already pointed to is how this is a show that doesn't really feature a lot of those classic Sondheim rhymes either. So I think if people are coming in like, oh, we're getting another show, they're going to be these great like internal and external rhymes. And while I will say there's a couple of moments I think fit that description, for the most part, this isn't that kind of show. It's very much not that show, and intentionally not that kind of show.
Yes, I think a lot of that, at least my impression of it is that so much of this show is that we're experiencing these characters feel things spontaneously, that they haven't really even had time to process what they're saying before they say it. And so I think having an excessive amount of rhyme would sort of betray Sondheim's, going back to the I feel pretty, and the person shouldn't be able to make these rhymes. And I think a lot of his characters are probably too caught up in what they're thinking to be able to think that clearly.
I think Fosca could have cleaned up the gang situation in New York City.
Yes.
Now, were you aware that this was based on, first a novella and then a movie from the 80s? Like, did you know about any of those?
I had no idea.
Okay.
Not a clue. And I still haven't read the novel or seen the movie, although based on what Sondheim has written about it, it sounds like there's no point in reading the novel, but that the movie's amazing. So maybe one day.
Yeah, I mean, I would maybe argue that point a little bit. I think there is reasons to like dig into the novel itself, especially as a historical piece for like where Italy was at that time. I think there's some interesting things. Actually, it's weird, but we were talking Dracula just very briefly before we pushed record. And I do think that there's some parallels between Dracula and Fosca, at least in writing style. Anyways, that's beside the point of what we're trying to do here.
Definitely both melodrama.
Of course. Yeah. So you go and see this show. And so what are your initial feelings? Everyone from the original cast was in the show when you saw it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So how did you feel about it?
Well, at first I was a little taken aback because I went with my mother. She and I took a trip to New York together, and she let me pick. We usually on our trips would mostly just get tickets when we got there, but we always made sure we bought tickets to one show in advance. And she let me pick, so I picked Passion, and we wound up getting tickets quite close to the stage. We were like fourth row. Wow. And then the curtain opened, and there are these two naked people. And my mother turns to me and says, "What kind of show did you bring me to?" And so I spent the first little bit of the show thinking, I'm not actually sure what I've brought you to. Aside from the fact that it was, that I was sitting there watching it with my mother, I really do think that scene is, quite intentional, that you're supposed to be taken aback by this, display of flesh, which then very rapidly leaves the show and doesn't really come back.
I agree. I think that is one of the things that I knew about this show for the longest time. Is like, this show has nudity in it. There's naked bodies on stage. And for some reason, I guess I thought that was just what the entire show was. It's called Passion, so I guess that kind of makes sense. When you do watch that recording that they made of the show, you're right. It's in that first scene, and then never again do you really come back to that idea. I mean, again, thematically makes sense. We're talking about carnal passion and then like a more like emotional passion by the end of this show. So it's an interesting build up of that idea. Right.
And certainly for that televised production, they toned down the nudity a bit. There was a bit more of it on stage, but it still wasn't excessive. And I think it's not at all gratuitous. It certainly serves the story.
And so, this is an intermissionless show. We go through the entire thing. Curtain comes down. What are you talking about with your mother after this show is done?
I remember just being a little stunned. I wasn't quite sure how I was supposed to react to it. I got the sensation that Giorgio had come to some great conclusion by the end of the show, that he'd had a transformation. But I wasn't quite sure what the transformation was. So I didn't come away from it going, aha, here's how we wind up the show. Here's how we're supposed to feel. It took me a long time thinking about it before I could sort of put the pieces together and sort them out, which is enjoyable. I enjoy doing that.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm discovering doing these recordings, there's a lot to dig into with this show. Not just with performance, but how this story is structured, what the music is doing. I have a question about the rest of your audience, because there's been a lot said about, at least in the previews, how audiences were reacting to this story outright. Like loathing the Fosca character, applause breaking out when she dies because people were just so sick of her. Did you notice any of that, or was this farther into the run where that really wasn't an issue anymore?
No, I did notice some of it, particularly the scene where she shows up in the train carriage. There was just this audible groan from the audience, like, oh, we thought we were going to get a scene without her, and here she is again. That sort of thing. I don't remember any cheering when she died, but I do remember that the audience I think they were having a lot of time making any connection with the Fosca character that they found useful. But I thought it was thrilling. And of course, seeing her perform the role, she's an amazing actor. So it was lovely.
Well, not only do you get Donna Murphy, you get Marin Mazzie in this show too. So I mean, talk about two powerhouses in the same show.
And I think I don't know, actually, Donna Murphy's resume before this. Marin Mazzie had not really had a tremendous amount of, I think she'd been on Broadway in 2 shows as replacement characters or something. One of them Into the Woods. But this was really the first time that most people would have ever seen her and recognized who she was. I'm not sure about Donna Murphy, but yes, they're stunning performances.
Yeah. Sondheim, at least in the Hat book, mentions the fact that he knew who Donna Murphy was, but knew her more as a comedian type of performer, which is kind of interesting, I guess, as her stature is now, which I wouldn't say holds that same same idea. But at the time, yeah, it's like I'd seen her in 2 like comedic performance roles. Thought that was kind of her specialty, but then comes into the auditions for this and kind of just knocks it out of the park. I'm like, well, it has to be her. Yeah, this is kind of her breakout role. So, I mean, it's been 30 years now since this show debuted on Broadway. From my perspective, I guess I don't know if you agree, but from my perspective, this does feel like the show that has essentially been reclaimed by Sondheim fans. I would definitely say when it first came out in the 90s, this was often like people's. And there's this one he came out with. Right. We put it down lower, but I feel like it's been rising in estimation from at least the diehard fans.
I would agree with you about that. There are, several shows that in their original production were maybe not as well received. Pacific Overtures, Merrily We Roll Along, seem obvious choices. And to a certain extent, they've all been reclaimed. Obviously, Merrily's been, triumphed now,
proven to work.
That's right. If everybody if everybody who says now that they always knew it could work had actually seen the production, it would still be running. But this one, I think, took its time before people. It basically gave it the space it needed to breathe. But I think the score is just so lush and so gorgeous. I think it's just hard to deny the quality of it, and so that made people go back and give it a second, third, fifth listen. And have really come to love it, I think.
Again, I can only speak from my own personal background here. I always liked the music of Passion, but I was never 100% sold on the lyrics, weirdly enough. It felt like it was just like being very straightforward, stating the obvious. Again, part of the point of the show is that, but like I always liked the music of this show, but now doing these deep dives, and definitely in like the last few years, I think interestingly enough through the pandemic and like just being by yourself and me, like, well, maybe I can explore some things that I haven't before. I kind of got more into like listening to this score, and it is one of those things which is so annoying when you're on the other side of this, but when you're in it, is like, well, you have to you listen to this a bunch of times. You have to listen to this a few times to like really understand it. When someone tells me that, I'm always like, oh, right, roll eyes. But I do really mean that. It's like, this is something that you have to like lean forward in and really engage with. This is not a passive listening experience, I don't think, to like fully get what's going on.
I definitely agree.
And sometimes that's just not what people are into. I get that. I guess before we delve into talking about the lyrics we're going to talk about here today, do you have like any hot takes, any like, I don't know, perspective on this show that you think that you want to share, I guess?
Well, I do think the score is amazing. I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, that in most productions of it that are staged now, I don't think most of them include the nudity. I think that's largely forgotten, or not forgotten, but purposefully omitted. And I think it can work either way. I think it has its has its place in the original production, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. And I actually think that might be beneficial for the show, because it stops being the Sondheim show with naked people. And people can focus on other things. I do love the way that the score is just a continuous song, basically, that's punctuated by scenes here and there. But there aren't very many places where there are complete songs with beginnings, middles, and ends. There are places that I wish there were, like the garden sequence, I think is gorgeous, but it's kind of a fragment of a song. It doesn't really stop. And there are times when I just want to put on that one track and listen to it as a complete piece, but it's not a complete piece. So it's a little frustrating, but also just gorgeous. So I think it's a really interesting show, but it does take a lot of attention and a lot of snare drums.
A lot of snare drums. There is that military madness that we've returned to over and over again. I think that's just a good call out as a kind of a last point here, because it is that rhapsody is what Sondheim keeps kind of describing this as, that one long continuous musical idea. That's the other hard thing, is like you listen to a song from this and it's like, well, it's like half of a song, or I think elsewhere in the book he talks about Anthony Perkins describing it as a songette or something like that, where it's not quite an actual song. It's like it's an idea of a song. I think there's 2, maybe 3, what I would consider like a full song in this score. But ultimately, it's just like this musical idea, and at the very end, we're going to all bring it together and finally have like a resolution to all of this stuff. But it's like a lot of build up with no payoff throughout most of this score.
Yes, which I mean has certainly sexual connotations as well.
Sure.
There's lots of build up, and then an eventual payoff.
This is the song where Sondheim wants to edge you, is basically what we're trying to say.
Pretty much, yes.
Hey everyone, just Kyle breaking into the conversation to tell you about some of the people that help this show continue to go. If you'd like to help support this show for absolutely free, you can give a rating and review on whatever app you listen to podcasts in. That's of course greatly appreciated. Putting It Together is an independent podcast, so if you'd like to help monetarily, which will only help to grow and make this show better, you can do so over at our Patreon page. That's www.patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Please do not donate if it impacts you negatively financially. I also need to give a huge thank you to the God That's Good tier from Patreon of Alex, Barry, Christopher, David, Jack, Luis, Michael, Mika, Robert, Stephen, and Whitty. All right, let's get back to the show. Okay, so we are here to discuss a few songs. Some people might be wondering, how are you going to cram all these songs into this? And let me tell you, it's 3 minutes of time. So right. I think it's going to be fine. But what are we talking about here today, Brian?
We are talking about the first 4 letter songs in the show. And this comes very early. It's right after the opening scene. And this is the next part that we move into. Right.
Okay. So great. So this is a great setup. I'm going to get you to do a very quick synopsis. What has happened in Happiness that we are now leading into these 4-letter songs with?
Well, Happiness is a very intimate scene between 2 people. They're in bed with each other. They're in the middle of making love. There are fairly overt orgasms on stage, especially when Clara has her line Giorgio at the end of the song. And it's very clear that this is a moment of carnal passion, of carnal lust. And they're also talking about the nature of their relationship, that they first start off talking about just how happy we are together. Aren't we wonderful? We're so glad we found each other. But we don't really know anything about their history or who these people are.
Right.
And then partway through the song, Giorgio announces that he's gotten orders to deploy with his military regiment. So we found, oh, he's a military person. We didn't know that. Clara is very upset about it. And this is sort of the point in the song where they begin to have some disagreement. She wants to live a little bit more in the here and now, and he wants to live a little bit more in the imagination. And then eventually they just wind up making love again, and the song comes to an end. Yeah. And then the next thing that happens is these letters that they exchange between each other.
And everything you just described, I don't know if you'll agree with me, but makes it the perfect show to go to see with your mother, I think is...
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Yes. So we are going to start off here with what is called letter 1. I guess is one last little piece of context. So Giorgio has met some of the other soldiers in his regiment. But yes, he's now reading this letter that I suppose... Well, we'll get into it. This is a letter he's writing to Clara, though, is what this first one is. Clara is reading it at first, and she goes, Clara, and Giorgio goes, Clara, I cried. And Clara says, I cried. And they both come together. Imagine that, a soldier who cries. And then Clara ends off by saying, I had to hide my eyes so the others on the train that carried me away from you would think I was asleep.
Clara, I cried.
I cried. Imagine that, a soldier who cries.
I had to hide my eyes so the others on the train that carried me away from you would think I was asleep.
So that's the entirety of letter number 1.
Yes. 10 lines. Partly, I think this is the writers setting us up for how the structure of the show is going to work. It's largely an epistolary show, so it's largely letters that are exchanged between people. And there is really nothing more static than watching people on stage read at each other. So It's sort of teaching us that here's how this is going to work. And we get Giorgio having written a letter, but Clara is the one who is reading it. And so we hear her voice, but it's his words. And then they sort of overlap each other to sort of get I think a lot of this is to show us that this is going to be a dynamic process, that the letter is not only has been written and delivered, but it's also being written at the moment it's being read, that a lot of it is about reaction and interpretation. And so these are still things that they're not finished even when they've been delivered.
So, yeah, and I think that this is the power of adapting this into a stage show. Something I think that it does even better than the movie does, and it's something you just simply cannot truly, or at least I don't think fully, show in a book of this, which is, yes, that moment of I am writing this letter now, and in real time I am seeing how the person receiving it is reacting to what I'm writing right now on the train. So for the person who's writing it, it's like just such an immediate emotional reaction that they're having, and they're writing it out on a piece of paper. Whereas Clara, conceivably, I guess at this time, is probably like a couple weeks later that she's probably reading this and reacting to how she imagines of Giorgio to be feeling at that time. So I think like acting wise, there's a lot here that an actor can really dig into to like how they're going to convey this, how they're going to act it, how they're going to read it and perform it. Yeah, I think there's just a lot here that you could play around with.
I do too. And it also sets up one of the contradictions in the show, because in the scene right before where Giorgio has been introduced to his new regiment, one of the things that happens is that one of the lieutenants, I forget which one of the Italian named lieutenants, says, I've heard about your triumphs, that you in the battle with the Russians, and you saved this man and you took him on horseback back to your battalion. And he steps in and says, well, it was only to camp. I didn't really do anything that brave. And Lieutenant Bari says something to the effect of, well, why not go ahead and say that you did it? Why be half a hero when with a small white lie, you can be a whole hero?
Sure. Yeah.
So we're set up with Giorgio being this person who's proclaiming to be fundamentally honest, that I'm not going to glorify what I did for, when it's for false purposes. But then in this first letter, he's saying, I deceived people. I was on the train and I didn't want people to know what I was feeling. And so I pretended to be sleeping when in fact I was crying.
Yeah. So two things. First off, there's a comparison I'm going to make between this and Company, which is like, gun to my head, could not tell you what each of the soldiers' names are. Right. You give me the list of their names, like, I don't know which one is which. In the same way of like Bobby's friends outside of Joanne, like, I don't know who any of these people are. I couldn't tell you which one is which. But the other one is this idea of Giorgio being a different person, right? So it's like his fellow soldiers are seeing this. Fosca will mention this too later on in the show, how it's like, I saw you, I knew that you were going to be different. And it ultimately comes down to the fact like he reads books and he's a bit emotional. So like that's what sets him apart from all these other men. And you're kind of getting this here, like right after the opening sequence of like, okay, like this person is not the same as these other soldiers over here.
Which, to follow up on the conversation they've been having as well, because they've been talking about the various officers who've been visiting the local whorehouse and having this fairly raunchy conversation among military men. And then Giorgio enters and he's supposed to be somebody different. He's sort of elevated above this, except of course we've literally just seen him having sex. So he's not really different than they are, but we're somehow supposed to think he is. Oh,
and one last thing, I guess, on this first letter, there is like a very brief rhyme here, a soldier who cries, I had to hide my eyes. So there is a bit of one little rhyming structure here. And furthermore, I'm sure people could like spend a lot of time and dissect this of like, when Clara sings, when Giorgio sings, when they sing together, what does all of that mean? And I'm sure there is probably intentionality behind all of this, but it is interesting that yes, it's broken up. It's not just Clara reading the letter from start to finish or Giorgio singing it as he's writing it. It's both of them coming together and kind of sharing back and forth this kind of conversation as he's writing the letter.
Absolutely. And that rhyme is shared between the two characters, but it's not just one of them saying it. So that sort of classic technique of, if characters are rhyming with each other, that shows that they're really connected. Okay, so then there is a book scene that happens here next. Gosh, we hear piano music in the background. I think Sondheim describes this as Chopin-esque in the background, or what it's supposed to be. And then we meet I always forget military rank, the lieutenant or who's in charge of this new he's the Colonel.
Captain? Colonel.
He's
Yes,
the
right.
colonel.
He's the colonel. And we meet the doctor as well in this scene. And they mention Fosca, I believe, at this point.
Yes.
But we don't see her. So the person playing that music is Fosca. We meet these two new characters in here, and then we move on to letter number 2. Anything you want to say, I guess, about the book scene in and of itself?
My cousin loves to read. It's her only passion, really. I can't find enough books for her.
I also love reading. I've brought a few of my favorite books down with me. Perhaps I could lend them to Signora Fosca, though I can't promise they'll appeal to her.
Young man, she's been driven to reading military handbooks. I've no doubt she'll welcome anything in print.
Well, I think it's interesting in that I think most people think of Fosca as being the center of this show, which I find strange because to me it's clearly about Giorgio, not about Fosca. But she's not on stage, and so this is her sort of first almost like ghostly appearance that we hear her and we hear of her before we meet her. And there's also a fair amount of exposition that goes on in this little scene. There's information that we get at one point. There's a conversation about Fosca where they talk about how little she eats and that she eats as little as a sparrow. And one of the lieutenants says something about a sparrow would eat more than she does or something like that. And her cousin immediately says she also loves to read. And like that line comes out of absolutely nowhere. I think it's meant for somehow that line to be embarrassing. He needs to cover up for his cousin and her weakness by just changing the topic. But it then brings in.
How dare she read books?
Exactly. Yeah. But it brings up the issue of reading and literature.
Yeah,
it reveals
and the thing
something
that kind of like binds them together at first, right?
It does. And it reveals something about Giorgio because up until this point, we don't know that he's particularly an intellectual person. We've seen him be someone who enjoys making love to beautiful women, and that's kind of it. And now we're like, oh, he's actually somebody who thinks. And so we get that information about him before we launch into the next part.
You know what? I don't know why I'm only having this realization now, but as you were describing kind of like the plot mechanics here, the other book that this is such an obvious like comparison point to, or movie if you're familiar with it, is Rebecca. In Rebecca, you never meet the other woman
right
that they mention and like has so much influence on the story. And this, at least for the first third, is like, you know, you hear about Fosca or understand about Fosca before you actually ever see her kind of come into the narrative sort of thing. And there's the gothic overtones and undertones and stuff that go through both of those stories. But anyways, that's an interesting comparison point you could make too.
Yes, I think so. And it's also that we, through the sequence, we find out that not only have we been hearing Fosca all along, her presence is felt, but we find out later that she's also been basically spying on what's been going on, that she's been watching and we didn't even know.
Sorry, what originally brought that comparison point up that I did not actually make is the idea that even though the book or the story is called A Woman's Name, it's actually really about another character that they're really investigating throughout that story. One last thing before we get into letter 2 here. I don't know if you share my new fan theory that is going to go through multiple episodes and people are going to get real sick of me talking about this. What is your feeling about the Doctor? I feel like the Doctor is, there's something going on with this dude, and I just don't know if other people feel the same way as I do. I think it's more pronounced in the book and in the movie. It's a little bit more tempered in this stage show, but I feel that there's something not quite like as benign as what he's trying to make it out to be.
I agree. There's that moment, I think it's between the second and the third letters, where he and Giorgio talk alone and Giorgio asks questions about Fosca. And the Doctor says, oh, don't worry, your curiosity is natural. Everybody wants to know these things. But then he's like, but let me go ahead and tell you about her physical condition and how that precludes her from being a sexual person, which is like,
right.
Okay, that's not really what he asked, but and a lot of information.
Interesting answer, but okay.
Right. So yes, I think that there's I don't know, perhaps he's just too interested in this, and I don't think in any sort of sexual way. I mean, he's talking about how Fosca can't be anybody's lover, but he is her doctor, and he talks about how he's always having to treat her even though there's nothing he can do for her. So I don't know if he's just frustrated with this case or. But yes, there definitely seems to be some kind of greater interest than
or some type of like an unsaid experiment he's trying to run between these two and see what's going on, sort of thing. Anyways, people can write in and see if they agree with me or not. Here's what letter number 2 is. Clara is reading or writing, I guess. Giorgio, I too have cried inside, and they both come together. You must not be ashamed of your tears. Clara goes, I love you for your tears, and they both sing, your absence only makes my love grow stronger, and when I cannot bear it any longer, and that's where it ends. So,
Giorgio, I too have cried inside.
You must not be ashamed of your tears.
I love you for your tears.
Your absence only makes my love grow stronger. And when I cannot bear it any longer.
Well, I think one of the differences that I see is that in Giorgio's letter number 1, there are all these I statements. I.
mhm.
And Clara is, she does have some I statements, but she also has some you statements. So she's sort of still thinking of them as being a couple, where Giorgio is really sort of fixated on his own experience. Not that I think that he's left her behind at this point by any stretch of the imagination. He's very clearly still in love with her, but she seems to be thinking about the two of them more than he is.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. That's a great call out here, where Giorgio is very much self-focused. The first part of the show, and eventually opens up. That's his like emotional journey that he goes through here, where Clara does seem to be like kind of there already, even though this relationship is kind of doomed to fail. You're starting to kind of see these cracks, even though they're not being super obvious about it. I also would say what a great, and maybe this is, part of the Italian language, what a great, happenstance it is that both Giorgio and Clara are just really fun to sing. Like they're very musical names so it's, I understand why Sondheim kind of goes back to that a bunch of times, just having them say the other person's name, because this fits really nicely when you sing it.
And are those the names that were used in the original novel?
They are, yes,
okay,
absolutely.
So Sondheim didn't even create those. He was given a gift.
He was. There was one last thing I was going to say here. Right. So the other rhyme that they share here together as characters, stronger and longer, right? So there is the subtext of them feeling that there's going to be this bigger emotional bond here through the show that we'll see kind of get picked apart. You've already mentioned what happens kind of in between this and the third letter, kind of that book scene, but we flash forward a little bit more. Another letter that Clara is reading, and Giorgio is doing maneuvers with his fellow soldiers. So there's kind of this like military march kind of thing that's going underneath these lyrics here. Clara reads, Clara, I'm in hell. This is hell, living hell, this godforsaken place, this sterile little town, these pompous little men, this military madness, uniforms. My days are spent in maneuvers, uniforms, my evenings in discussing the day. This is hell. My nights are spent in thinking of you. Don't forget me, Clara.
Clara, I'm in hell.
This is hell.
Living hell, this godforsaken place. This sterile little town, these pompous little men.
This military madness.
Uniforms.
Military madness. My days are spent in maneuvers. My evenings in discussing the day.
This is hell. My nights are spent in thinking of you.
Don't forget me, Clara.
The biggest earworm I get from this show is that uniforms. I don't know why that's the thing that gets stuck in my head all the time.
The same with me. I think in addition to the fact that this is more of a complete letter, the first two are just total fragments.
That's right.
Is that we do have the soldiers singing the lines of the letter. Now, of course, as characters on stage, I don't think they have any idea that what they're saying is a letter between these two people. But as an audience member, all of a sudden there's this extra third voice, if you think of the soldiers as a collective voice coming in, that's part of the letter between these two people. There's also the fact that this, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is the first letter that doesn't really focus on the two people and how much they miss each other.
Yeah,
at the very end, he says, my evenings are spent in thinking of you. But the rest of the letter is him basically just complaining about how much he's not enjoying being there.
I mean, going back to those I statements, right? It's like, I'm in hell. This is happening to me. This is what's awful about it. And then, don't forget about me, Clara. I think about you sometimes in the evening. Like that's basically the rest of this letter, which is an interesting communication. I guess the one aspect of this too, just kind of going back to the Giorgio characterization, is again, something that is different from him is that he is not like these soldiers. He is really describing himself as apart from these soldiers, right? It's like, I get up, I do these maneuvers, and then I go to dinner and I have to talk about the maneuvers we just ran during the day. Like, that's basically the entire intellectual stimulation that I have throughout the day, is just doing the same thing over and over and over again. And I get to talk about that with these same people at the dinner table. So yes, he's in a sort of madness here of just not being able to do what he wants to do.
And in that scene with the right before this letter with the doctor, I think the first thing the doctor said to Giorgio is that the men are responding well to your command. In other words, he's like, you're doing a good job. You're leading your men, and they're responding to you. So we know, we've heard that he's a war hero from before, and now we hear that he's a good commander. And then he complains basically about being in the army. Because the things he's talking about are basically anybody who would be in the military. This is what you do. He seems unsatisfied with it, even though anybody could have told him that that is what his career would be if he went into the army. So it's a strange sort of thing to complain about when, he's really thinking about something else, which is, I want to be with Clara.
But he, young man in love, trying to figure out his emotions and stuff like that. But yeah, and especially like when this story is being set here, I guess I don't know a huge amount of the Italian history of what was going on, but like, unless he would learn to trade, I don't know what other options there really were besides the military for him to go into. So this is like maybe a forced reality for him. It's one of those things that, it is what it is, unless you're going to learn one of the trades so you don't have to be in like these military uniforms and stuff all the time. Right. That's what your options are.
This story is set in, I think, 1863, if I'm not mistaken,
I believe you're right,
which is just a couple of years after the founding of the state of Italy as a country.
Yeah. This is very new in like what we consider Italy was very new as a concept.
And they're at war with France. And we obviously heard they were at war with Russia earlier. So it isn't. It's a time where if you went into the military, you could expect to be deployed and actually seeing battlefield action. And yet he seems surprised by this or upset about it. Sort of like, well, then don't go in the military because you know what's going to happen.
All right. So we have another book scene here with the doctor. Days go by. He's at the breakfast table. And we have our last letter here that we're going to talk about on this episode. And Clara and Giorgio start off by, "How could I forget you?" And then we see Fosca's shadowy figure in the background coming down the stairs. And it's really just a solo here by Clara, who sings, "Yesterday I walked through the park to the knoll where we met. Afterwards I sat on the bench where we sat all the sultry afternoon. I thought about our room, our little room, where we were happy and where we shall be happy again someday. I see you in our room, our little room, and I don't feel so alone anymore. I close my eyes, imagining that you are there, imagining your fingers touching mine, imagining our room, the bed, the secrecy, the world outside, your mouth on mine."
How could I forget you? Yesterday I walked through the park to the place where we met. Afterwards I sat on the bench where we sat all that sultry afternoon. I thought about our room, our shuttered room, where we were happy and where we shall be happy again someday. I see us in our room, our secret room, and I don't feel so alone anymore. I close my eyes, imagining that you were there, imagining your fingers touching mine, imagining our room, the bed, the secrecy, the world outside, your mouth on mine.
This is a letter that we don't hear Giorgio singing back to her, right?
That's right.
It's just Clara singing.
And I think this is the first place in the show where we find out the history of their relationship, that this was and it sounds, I mean, as much as it's couched in very romantic language and that the music is gorgeous, basically what they're describing is a casual pickup in the park. That one day they were both in the park, they saw each other, and somehow or another they fell into each other's arms.
You know how it is. You accidentally fall into someone's bed sometimes.
That's right. Sometimes it just happens.
I actually do think that there was a mention of this in a book scene somewhere. Maybe it's even in the lyrics of Happiness very subtly, but like in the book, it's very explicit. He accidentally knocks on the wrong door is actually what happens. And she opens it, and then he's directed to the right door he's supposed to go to, has his conversation, but then comes back to her and knocks on it again. He was like, I felt a connection with this person. But in this exchange here, you have something even more illicit, I guess, for lack of a better word, because we do know that she is a married woman. So like this is extra scandalous of what's going on.
You're right. In Happiness, it's actually right at the very beginning of Happiness. She says the sadness in your eyes that day when we glanced at each other in the park. Right. So there was that callback to this sort of casual meeting that has led to this relationship. And all of that development is conveniently left out because we don't need to hear about that. We just need to know what happened.
It is true. Like, yeah, we don't need to get bogged down by like plot mechanics and stuff here. This show is so much about emotions that like over explaining things would probably be like, this is the wrong direction this show needs to go in. We just need to stay on the emotional plane.
One thing that I do feel is really interesting about this is that Clara is, having a memory of the early times in their relationship and the moments that they spent together, which were these sort of stolen moments when she could get away from her husband and child and they could meet in what I'm assuming is probably Giorgio's room, wherever he was staying. And she refers to it as our room, our little room. And I don't know if you remember, but the room has like 28-foot ceilings and like velvet curtains that are 3 stories tall. It's not a very little room, but for a Broadway stage, she's then projecting what she wishes were the case. And at this point, she's still projecting, I see us in our room, our little room, the secrecy, the world outside. So even when she's projecting the fantasy that she wishes, it's still where the two of them are just getting away for rendezvous in this room. She's not really imagining a relationship.
I think that's the next crack that starts to form here is like she focuses on, remember our secrecy that we had, like that that's part of the allure for her, is that this is a secret thing that's just between them. This is never going to be something that is said out loud to the world.
Absolutely. And even when their relationship progresses through the letters where they begin talking about, well, what would it look like if we were together? It's still a remarkably pragmatic view of things from Clara's point of view.
I'm going to forget now because I've been bouncing around the score here so much. But even the melody here, I think, is a callback to a section from Happiness.
I think it is, yes.
It does go through the rest of the show here. We keep kind of coming back to the little room, our little room, that Clara mentions multiple times throughout the rest of the show here. So again, just talking about that rhapsody, the musical fragments that get filtered throughout the entire score here. Because none of these letters that we've talked about here are full musical ideas with resolutions or anything like that. Right. Most of them get cut off halfway through reading the letter, including this one. We're getting like that rising tension that never gets resolved until the very end of the show.
And I think you're right about the callback to Happiness, which is this interesting. I'm sure you talked about this on your episode about that, but this interesting, the song's called Happiness, and this interesting moment where they say the word happiness over and over and over again. And so it's very easy to listen to it and go, oh, these two people are very happy because they keep saying happiness, until you listen to what they're talking about and you realize, well, I don't know if they're really happy. They're certainly having some fun right now, but that's not quite the same thing.
So overall, if we were to take a look at this kind of like section of the show that interweaves all these letters, how do you think this works in the show? Or how do you feel about this sequence, I guess, more than anything?
Well, I do think it's doing some very crafty work. It's doing a lot of exposition. We find out about a lot of characters. We know who Fosca is before we meet her. We think we have a relatively complete vision of who she is, which of course we find out later is not at all true. But we think we do. We see Clara and Giorgio trying to maintain their relationship. And even though they're both clearly upset about being apart, they do seem committed, at least through letter writing, to try to stay together. I think in the original production, the use of the scrims where you can see people behind scrims at certain points, but they seem rather ghost-like. Shows this whole idea that there are things in this relationship that are not fully present, but they're sort of lingering in the background. So I think from a design point of view, it's doing some work, which is really good. And I do think it's really teaching us how to understand the show, that it's, letting us know this show is going to largely be conducted through letters, but we're also going to make sure that you're not just watching two people read letters at each other, that there's going to be more going on. And it's a really dynamic process, even though reading letters can seem very static.
I would actually love to know more information about James Lapine's help with figuring that sort of thing out of like, this is how we're going to visually show the audience how they're speaking back and forth. Because talk about how I think this would have been like the absolute death knell of a show of like, we're just going to see these people read out their letters and sing out their letters. That's not very visually interesting or like dramatically interesting either.
No.
But like getting into this situation of like both at the same time, other characters coming in and having that more of a dynamic feel to it. It's like, yes, okay, this is what great art can do and elevate what would otherwise be a kind of a boring interchange between these two characters.
Right. Yes. The stage is usually, tensions between showing and telling, and showing is always more interesting than telling, but letters are all about telling. So you've got a show that's based on something that ought not to work, but I think it's actually doing some very interesting work very quickly.
Well, great. Thank you so much here, Brian. The last question I've been asking everyone here this season, or beginning to ask everyone here this season, is the show, of course, is called Passion, and you can take this in any direction you want. But right now, what would you consider the thing you're the most passionate about?
I think right now I'll be completely self-centered. I'll be Giorgio here for a moment.
Sure.
I think the thing I'm passionate about is self-care. This is a very strenuous time in the world, and certainly here in the United States. We're still I work in education, and in some ways we're still in the post-COVID era, where even though we're far past it, we're still dealing with the echoes of what was created. And there have been, since you and I spoke about A Little Night Music, there have been some personal things that have gone on in my life. And I really feel committed and passionate about making sure I take care of myself.
I think that's such an important message that I think has to continue to be communicated. Again, to echo Glenn, what you're saying here, in dark times, I think the impetus is like, how can I help, or even just retreating or something. But you also have to make sure that you take care of yourself first before you can go and help other people as well. So it's like, make sure you're safe, that you're mentally ready, and then you can like lead with empathy and lead with whatever it is you want to help other people with.
Absolutely.
Brian, like I said, thank you so much for doing this. If people wanted to stay in contact with you, and there's a little cat that just jumped up.
That's my cat.
Cute.
Yes, that's Captain Margaret, named after one of the characters in Sense and Sensibility.
I thought it was going to be Margaret Thatcher you were going to reference, but
my other cat is Angela Lansbury, but she's not on camera.
Sometimes she's shy. So, but if people wanted to stay in contact with you, is there a way for people to do so?
Absolutely. I'm an old, so I'm usually on Facebook. That's my social media of choice. I do teach at a college in South Carolina called Limestone University, and I'm in the English department there. So people can look me up there and get in touch with me, and I'm happy to talk about things. I've heard from some people after the A Little Night Music episode, which was just thrilling to hear from total strangers out of the blue saying, I want to talk about what you said. So that was fun.
That's amazing. Oh, cool.
Yes.
Cool. Great. Well, thanks again, Brian.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. You can send emails to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow Sondheim Podcast on either Twitter or Instagram. This is an independent production, and you can support the show on Patreon by going to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Putting It Together is available on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere you can get podcasts from. Consider subscribing so that you never miss an episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about I Read. Well, I don't. As always, a big thank you to the great Chris Taniguchi, who designed our podcast artwork, and to Nick Driscoll for composing our theme music. Well, we've reached the end of our episode. Yes, I know. Goodbye for now.